This is a panel on managing and monitoring for learning. Is a little bit of a sequel from this morning, the panel on going from contracts to relationships. Hopefully diving into some details on what is possible, what is emerging in the field of monitoring and in the practice of managing for fostering learning in organizations doing development. The monitoring discipline in development is affected by different schools of thought and agendas. The most prominent are the deterministic, linear, and quantitative monitoring practices. They emanate from a positivist school of thought, where credibility and integrity are given most attention in the relationship between fund donors and recipients, and attribution occupies a central part in the funder's relationship with the intervention. Outcomes are theorized and calculated results of activities and outputs, as proven from previous pilots aimed at proving the concepts. The practice has the advantage of simplicity and cookie-cutter scalability. It allows donors to fund large-scale projects and systematize accountability. It puts funds recipients in implementation and reporting roles and produces data proving the execution of basic itemized activities. Practical accounts of development initiatives, from access to water to economic development, point to general challenges in this type of systems. They don't necessarily actually generate accurate information because of a principal-agent relationship between those reporting on those activities and the people wanting to learn about them. The program course corrections are seldom initiated, so when things are not working, not necessarily is it followed by actions for course correction. They take away a lot of the management resources available to make those learning, actionable, and takes that that management time towards reporting and feeding in data on activities. Sorry. They muffle all incentives for learning close to the ground and even create an organizational culture of rejection of learning, where where learning is becoming perceived as taking the responsibility for the failure of the activities that are prescribed. On the other hand, there is an emerging field that treats development in a different way, that says systems are complex, making a change in development or making a change in a community is actually a complex and has to be a learning process. And let's create tools to enable organizations to do that close to the ground. So the three panelists have been invited to speak for their expertise in these emerging practices. So I would like to thank them for joining us and contributing to this panel. I think it will be pretty exciting. We have David Bond right on my left, CEO of Keystone, and also participating in this morning's panel. Stacy Young, she's a Senior Knowledge Management Advisor at USAID, and Soli Gariba, the Director of Institute for Policy Initiative in Alternatives in Ghana. I will let you make a 10-minute presentation or a 10-minute contribution to this discussion, and then we'll go directly to questions from the audience. Stacy, if you want to start, if you have.
So I'm going to speak very briefly, I can speak at great length, but won't do that, about an activity that I've been involved with our Uganda mission, USAID Uganda office. So I just want to describe the context briefly, and then I'll talk about what we're doing. As you know, we got a new administration in 2008 as a result of that election, and that new administration brought new priorities in general, but including for U.S. foreign assistance and the work that USAID does. One of the new priorities has to do with changing the way that we do our strategic planning, and so the agency leadership devised new guidance for missions to develop 5-year strategies that we're calling country development cooperation strategies. The Uganda mission volunteered to be one of 3 missions to pilot this new guidance, And so that constituted an opportunity in and of itself. And particularly because the mission director there, who's a guy named Dave Eckerson, is a bright guy and an iconoclast and not afraid to confront the things that we're doing that aren't working. There was an opportunity to really look at doing things differently. So Dave invited me and another person named Tony Pryor, who works for the International Resources Group in Washington, but worked for years inside USAID, to work with the mission on developing the country's strategy. I focused primarily on how to integrate learning and adapting throughout the portfolio and through the implementation of the strategy, or the plans for implementing the strategy over the next 5 years. So a little bit of information about the mission program. The annual budget is a little bit over $300 million a year, and it focuses in 3 sectors: health, agriculture and food security, and democracy and governance, and implements dozens of projects in those sectors. So the problem that the mission was confronting and didn't want to replicate was its experience with past strategies. So they had put a lot of energy in the past into developing strategies, but then through implementation found that they weren't coordinating well even internally across the different technical areas, as well as externally with other development actors. They also found that they weren't taking advantage of new learning that was being developed in their sectors or about the country, or on operational levels, like, how do you work with this ministry, or how do you work with that local government entity. And then they also found that their implementation strategies were fairly static, whereas the context is, of course, dynamic. So this relates to what Dave Snowden was saying last night about the limitations of a rigid management approach, given that the systems in which we work are complex adaptive systems. So in their past experience, what they had seen was that increasingly over the period during which a strategy was implemented, the strategy and implementation began to diverge, so that the strategy's utility as a roadmap to get from where we are to where we would like to be vis-a-vis our development objectives, that utility as a roadmap was lost. And so, like any roadmap that doesn't get us where we want to go, it ended up in the glove box, and all the energy that went into it was lost, and its use was also lost. So the solution, or a potential solution, and I say potential because the whole strategy, including the learning component that we devised, is still in review in Washington, but it's getting favorable reviews, and we're hoping that it will become a model for the agency. The solution is this component that we're calling collaborating, learning, and adapting. And it really is a range of activities and approaches that are designed to enable the mission to work differently internally and with its partners and other stakeholders to do all 3 of these things. So on the collaboration front, the aims have to do with reducing duplication of efforts and also identifying places where there's a chance to increase synergy of efforts. On the learning front, there are a couple different ways that they would like to learn. One of them has to do with testing development hypotheses, which I think is really important because we bring a lot of assumptions into how we implement that have to do with, well, if we do A, B, and C, then X, Y, and Z will happen. And sometimes X, Y, and Z does happen, but we don't know why. And sometimes X, Y, and Z doesn't happen, and we don't know why. So testing those hypotheses is really important to inform future plans and implementation. They also are focusing through this component on using relevant learning that's being developed elsewhere, sharing what they learn so that it can be applied more broadly, and this is critical, really drawing on a lot of different types of learning, including tacit knowledge. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then on the adaptation front, the focus is really on what we've been talking about over the last couple of days, which is making iterative course corrections to implementation as we go, not waiting for a project to end to say, boy, wouldn't it have been nice if in year 2 we had done something differently. So there are, in this plan for the CLA component that underlies the whole strategy and the whole mission portfolio, there are many, many activities that we're planning. I'm just going to touch on a few because we don't have much time. but we can talk about others during the discussion. In terms of collaborating, the obvious first step is to figure out who's doing what where. So the mission's GIS staff and the technical teams are working to map where the mission is working, in what sectors and what geographic parts of Uganda, and also the intensity of the investment, which is represented here, but not in a way that you can actually see from where you're sitting. But really mapping mission activities, but then also mapping activities of other development actors, including other donors, the government of Uganda, civil society, NGOs, and so on. So who's doing what where, and then identifying from that, whom should we be working with? You can't work with everybody all the time, it doesn't make sense. So really looking at strategic priorities where together, working together can yield some synergies, or where the mission can, sorry, the formatting got messed up because I use a Mac, where the mission can, through its contribution to something that somebody else is doing, really make a small but strategic investment that multiplies the impact of somebody else's larger investment. So we don't have to cover the whole waterfront, and we don't have to cover it equally, but we need to look for strategic ways to collaborate. And then, of course, looking at ways to reduce conflict where we're working in a space where somebody else is also working, but from a different perspective. So one of the ways that we have in mind to make this work is by dedicating a facilitator to working specifically on coordination and collaboration. Once the mission has identified those strategic opportunities, having somebody whose job it is and whose skill set it is to work as a liaison between mission programs and other actors to really look at how we can get some win-win solutions to the problem of lack of coordination and collaboration. On the learning side, again, learning both in terms of analytics and in terms of experiential knowledge. So we're looking at ways to use the M&E results, the results from the M&E activities that are already in place, but also expanding those activities so that we're tracking not only project interventions, but also the context, since the point of the interventions is to change the context, and also tracking broadly enough to be able to capture unanticipated outcomes so that we understand more fully what the dynamics of the system are. Synthesizing existing research. The technical experts don't have time to acquaint themselves with all of the new learning that's being developed. So one of the functions of the CLA component will be to synthesize relevant research and work with the technical experts to figure out what the implications are for their programs. Project and program evaluations and impact assessments are a really strong priority of the agency now. We are reinvigorating our capacity to do impact assessments, so those will also be important to this process. And then conducting new studies of some key questions. So one example of that would be the agriculture strategy, agriculture-led food security strategy, focuses on two value chains, maize and coffee. But nobody yet has done the analytics to understand what climate change projections have to say about how those two crops will be affected by climate change and by increases in temperature. So doing a study of that will help inform whether it makes sense to hang the whole agriculture strategy on those two commodities. On the experiential side, we have plans for a range of activities that are really designed to shift the culture of the organizations so that people are in a better position to share their tacit knowledge, to share their observations. This is very much in line with a lot of what EWB does and what I saw EWB helping the Profit Project do. So really looking at how can we capture those observations in real time and assess their implications for implementation. And then another piece of this is really working closely with local thought leaders in Uganda. Ugandans and expats who've been in Uganda for a long time, to get that depth of knowledge about that context and about the sectors in which we're working. So there's a tool that the mission has used that we are adapting to align with the priorities of the CLA component, and it's called the portfolio review. In the past, the mission has done 2 portfolio reviews every year, and they've really been focused on performance monitoring and accountability. And the culture around this has been such that when I asked people and showed them a graphic of somebody cowering as others were pointing the finger of blame at them, everybody smiled and laughed and nodded their heads. So the culture of the portfolio reviews has really been a blaming culture. So we're looking at working explicitly on the messages that come from senior management and on the processes that guide those portfolio reviews to shift from the accountability/blaming approach to more of an investigatory learning approach. What's happening? Does it diverge from our expectations? Why is that? What can we understand from that? And then also emphasizing problem solving. So that's one of the 2 annual portfolio reviews. The second is an entirely different exercise than what they've had before. We're calling it a big picture reflection, in which we convene mission staff, but also implementing partners, government counterparts, other donors, thought leaders who have no funding relationship with USAID, but have deep knowledge, to come together to ask the big questions. Are our objectives still the right ones? Are our strategy and hypotheses holding? What's happening with some game-changing trends in Uganda, such as population and the discovery and exploitation of oil in the western part of the country? What are the implications for our program? What kinds of course corrections do those suggest? Okay, so one example of then adapting, being the third part of the collaborating, learning, and adapting approach. And this is hypothetical, again, because we're just at the beginning of implementation. So for example, let's say that the big picture reflection reveals that civil society is not having a lot of success holding government accountable for what it's doing with the revenues from the petroleum in the western part of the country. But that big picture reflection also reveals that there's one organization that's doing a good job. So the adaptation could be that members of the technical teams work together and with other donors and subject matter experts to figure out what are the conditions that have enabled this success, how can we intensify those conditions and support that success, how can we extend and replicate. Finally, I just want to make a point about who is involved in this. It's not the job of one person or a few people who are attached like a barnacle to the ship that is the mission, but rather it really is integrated throughout the whole mission. It's the job of everybody. So it's led by a CLA advisor who's somebody who really knows development, who really knows Uganda, who understands adult learning, who's a good facilitator, who can do research, but is also working closely with the program staff, the M&E staff, and the GIS staff, subject matter liaisons from the technical teams, gender and youth liaison, and some resource people who can perform the facilitation function, conduct the research, and so on. And then, of course, the role for partners and stakeholders and local leaders. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Hi, Boris is going to help me get some images up to be aids to the talk, but I'll just start while he's working in the interest of time. So I was on the panel this morning, and I have to start with an apology for those of you who were there. There's going to be a significant overlap, though not entire, hopefully, and a different orientation, more toward the learning and practical stuff than the kind of framing we were using around contracting. I'm going to make 4 points in this short talk. The first is that when we talk about monitoring and managing for learning, we have to ask the question, thanks, Boris, you know, for what? Learning for what? And the underlying problem to answering that question is that we don't know. And the central problem that I think bedevils across a lot of our work is that there's no ultimate performance principle in social change and development, like profit maximization in the business world. And so we're constantly working with proxies and negotiating around proxies, and the whole process of social value creation is an ambiguous one inherently for some of the reasons Boris mentioned in his intro. So that's always we're going to stumble around that. The way we approach learning in that context is important. Second, I'm going to say something about a theory of measurement and a theory of development, because you need a theory in order to move through consciously to practice. And indeed, improve and learn. Check against your theory, test your hypotheses. Third point is that there's been an explosion of new tools and frameworks in this space in the last decade. I'm just going to kind of breeze through a few images of some of them and mention what I think are the features that seem to be emerging as the new generation of tools. I think I really like some of the tools. And lastly, I'm going to share some thoughts about what I think is a candidate for, if not an ultimate performance principle, a really powerful performance management norm that can help us be better learners and indeed better development practitioners. Okay, so this image is meant to describe the world we have, and it's one in which you could blow out the donor social investor box. It's often multiple donors, and above the donors there may be, and if you're dealing with public aid agencies, there's authorizing parliaments and things. And then you can also blow out the implementers box. It's often implementers working with implementers, and then finally you get to folks on the ground who are supposed to be enjoying development. And so it's a long value chain, it's a complex value chain, and the point I want you to take away from this is that because it's hard to align incentives and learning and information across such a long system, the principal agent problem and so on, what happens is we go for a kind of lowest common denominator. We're extracting basic information around how the money is being spent, and you end up with a kind of upward accountability dynamic that drives the system, rather than a kind of whole system learning dynamic. And that it's just hard to move out of that kind of default mode. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, though that's the challenge that's in front of us. Okay, something about a theory of change. So our theory of change at Keystone is that societies solve tough problems when they learn how to solve them. And therefore, all of us who are engaged in social change in any way have a responsibility and a role around enabling societal learning at multiple levels. If we're not doing that, we're missing an important part of our missions, and the ways that we work need to enable others to learn, because nobody can solve this by themselves. And I think this kind of flowed out indirectly. I think you could look at what Stacy was saying in terms of how they're working to try to move out of one institution and move into working with a number of institutions to begin to actually tackle the learning question. And it's just, you just kind of can't go it alone. It's a kind of a key thing. Other thing at the heart of it is all development, as we know, I think, is self-development. So ultimately, it has to land with the people who are meant to benefit and what their relationship to this is, and I'm going to say a lot more about it. But we rely very heavily on the work of Amartya Sen in our work, Development as Freedom, and the kind of individual human agency at the heart of development. Okay. When I started doing this work about 6 years ago, I looked very hard at what was being done in the field of evaluation. And one of the questions I asked is, why did people evaluate? And I looked at hundreds of evaluations and articles about evaluations, and I found 6 different purposes that were used in evaluative activities. And these are the 6. From the bottom kind of the pyramid: to improve, to build capacity, to demonstrate results, this is the proof piece, to inform strategy, to sustain your legitimacy, and ultimately to educate society. Most of the work around evaluation today is more kind of around the demonstrating results and a bit about building capacity, a bit about improvement. Some informing strategy. Doesn't really do much for legitimacy, actually, because we don't do evaluation very well, so we don't become more legitimate as a result. And very little of societal education, I think. And we can ask the question, is that the right kind of way in which we think about the purposes, and how do you balance across the purposes when you design evaluative activities, when you approach learning activities? But the second point to make about this, and it's almost the most important one, is which of these purposes you think is important changes dramatically on where you sit. So for large funding agencies, demonstrating results is really important. But if you're a woman in a community trying to organize a new business venture, you don't care about demonstrating results. You want evaluative information that's going to help you improve. It's just, so the question, you kind of have to start to think about a matrix that looks at evaluative information from the point of view of its purpose and the particular constituent that you're looking at, the particular stakeholder. Okay. In our journey to try to find better measures, better practices for measuring and communicating change, we ended up with 4 principles. And I think these principles echo nicely from what Stacy just said. The first is you have to be clear about your goals. You have to establish a set of hypotheses, if you will, that are testable hypotheses. We say, clarify your purpose and map the pathways to your outcomes. The big phrase that's being used now in a lot of the tools is create your theory of change. But all that means is really setting a clear set of a story about how you think change is going to happen and how you're going to know if it does. The second is, you can't, as I was saying before, you can't do it at the level of the organization. You have to actually do it at the level of the ecosystem that you're in. And therefore you have to work with the other stakeholders to establish the right indicators, the right signals about what's going on, and indeed the right things to be doing in the first place. Thirdly, that when you go public, and this is where you have your opportunity to educate society at large about what you've learned and what you've achieved, don't just report what you think. Report what everybody who's been affected by what you do thinks about what you think happened. And in order to do that, you actually have to have a dialogic process. So we've developed methodology which says when you get your measures, when you get your monitoring data, go talk to the communities about what you see happening and see what they say about that. And then, when you publish your reports, publish both what you've measured and what people say about what you've measured. So we're starting to create a genuine reflective learning process. And it's a way, in a sense, to validate. Because in the development space, actually, no data has meaning in and of itself. The data, the information, gets its meaning in a social context through people. And we could, even hold up an object and people can disagree about what that object is. So you need to have a kind of conversation about it. It's never simple. So that's the point about, I call that last one the feedback principle of public reporting. And then the last thing we've kind of taken away from our work, and it's become the heart of our work, and it's what we do, is we talk about fostering constituency voice. And constituency voice is what happens with your stakeholders, with the people you're trying to see benefit from your work. It's what happens to them when they're involved in a meaningful way in kind of planning and assessing the work. And so it's really their voice that ultimately decides. This is our theory of change planning tool. It's just I wanted to give you an image of a new generation, and you can look at it. It's free on our website. This is a framework that was just published by a Harvard Business School professor who I think is one of the most thoughtful people on learning and development, Al-Noor Ibrahim, which maps levels, different operational strategies against different theories of change. And this is the kind of complexity that I think we need to be getting into now to create frameworks where we can ask the right learning questions. And then this is a really interesting piece of work. This is a snapshot from a website that was created by McKinsey & Company, the consulting firm, and they made this free. They produced a report called Learning for Social Impact. It's really interesting that McKinsey chose to give it this title, and they get that the number one thing foundations need to do and steward is learning as grant makers around social problems. And they've created this interactive website tool to do this, and it's kind of state-of-the-art. And like Al-Noor Ibrahim's model, it contrasts theories of change, they call them types of social intervention, but then they build onto that 4 levels of a problem in its development in terms of its being solution: framing, developing, demonstrating, refining solutions, and then scaling and sustaining. And then for each of these, when you go through the website, it'll generate learning questions and approaches toward getting at data, methodologies, and so on. And they produced, anyway, so it's all there and it's all free on the web, and I like it. This is another example from that. These are just more images from our website. and that's the site to it. Oops. This is what happens when you add systematic feedback to that earlier slide that I suggested. That's where the red is. In the interest of time, I'm not going to explain this. I think the point is obvious. But what I do want to say is that what kind of made the light bulb go on for me on this was the way customer satisfaction industry works in the business world. And the piece that I want to emphasize for the conversation about learning is that what drives learning in business is competition. Okay, you learn in order to survive, and there's actually, if you go into the theory of organizational learning, most of the kind of the key point that comes out of it again and again is that organizations change when they have to change. We do things more or less as long as they keep working, and then when they stop working, okay, then we change. And that's pretty much, at a systemic level, that's how it works. So you need to have comparability. You need to have comparison. If we don't have comparison and you don't have some kind of choice, it doesn't create that incentive, that forcing mechanism for learning. And so what these guys did so brilliantly in the customer satisfaction industry was they started to publish tables that showed which products were preferred by consumers, and that then forced the companies to pay attention to their surveys, and they'd buy the underlying information. And that's how this industry works. That's its business model, right? So it's really useful data for the consumer because consumers want to see how other consumers rate products, and it's really useful information for the companies. So how can we get to something like that in social change? How can we get to something like that in development? 2 minutes. So what we've been doing for the last few years is running benchmark feedback surveys where we've been asking constituents of organizations who are the similar kinds of organizations. We get a cohort of like organizations. We just released a report this week that speaks to this, where we had 25 large international development NGOs from the US and the UK and the Netherlands agree to use a common survey instrument that we then delivered across over 1,000 of their developing country partners. And it's on our website. You can look at the report, but it basically shows what these 1,000 developing country partners said about each of these 25 INGOs in terms of what kind of partner they were and what it was like to work with them. There are 120 data points in the questionnaire. It's really very detailed and goes into a lot of useful information about where to improve. But at the end of the day, the reason I believe that these INGOs will actually act on the data in this report is because their board members are going to see, gee, we're at the 25th percentile in the class on this issue of our contracting process. We've got to do better. We're going to survey again in 18 months, and we don't want to be at the bottom of the class anymore. So it's creating this dynamic so that the data actually flows through and it goes right down to managers, and managers have to improve and learn. So I think that's really, I think I can leave it there. I talk more about the doing of the surveys and things, but the point I would leave is that it's not expensive to do. It's a lot less expensive than the current monitoring kind of activities and evaluation activities that we're engaged in. And but what it leads to, and this is my last point, is that while I'm all about getting this data and driving this data into organization management systems, the key to the whole thing is not the data, it's the relationships you have with your constituents. So you use the data to improve your relationships, and you will only do that if, when you've heard from people, you go back to them and say, okay, we asked you, you told us, we reflected on it, we're thinking about making these improvements. What do you think about that? And then you go ahead and start to make changes and improve. And when you do that, the next time you survey, you'll find that your scores have gone up and that things are moving in the right direction. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Even before I started, the moderator told me 2 minutes. So I'm going to really obey the rule. What I wanted to talk about is really not so much building on the first two presentations, but getting back to basics. About 10 years ago, as an evaluator, a professional evaluator, I had been challenged in many, many respects in both formal and informal settings to think about capacity building for African evaluators. And this capacity building was always based on a certain asymmetry of teaching African evaluators the methods of project evaluation, often based on donor-constructed projects, the inputs, the outputs, the log frame, and it became really problematic to do so in the context of African professional evaluators whose only livelihood for evaluation will be based entirely on donor projects. And so I began with a number of colleagues to investigate whether or not there is evaluation in the indigenous knowledge systems of African societies, and to use those trajectories that we could find from our own indigenous knowledge systems to begin to create not only a notion of African evaluation, but also a movement that would give conceptual basis to evaluation in Africa. And therefore, through that processes, we now have an African Evaluation Association, for which I was president for a number of years, and country chapters are emerging. And so my presentation is really about the discovery of the patently learning dimension of evaluation in traditional societies. And it, as my colleague was saying, around the very, very essence for which evaluation and monitoring are used for learning. If you take the simplest common denominator, that in traditional societies, you start a social transformation endeavor not because of an external stimulus for designing a project. When you want to start a farm, or even the most current example for me, my brother was going to get married. The first step you take is to go and consult with local knowledge vectors to say, I want to get married, or I want to start a farm. Please give me some basic navigational tools to assess whether or not this thing I'm about to do will have a reasonable chance of success. And that knowledge vector would start the inquiry with you by locating what you're about to do in the context of your universe, a wider social context. They find out who your parents are, how many people are in your family. Many, many questions that may be tangential to the activity you're going to undertake, like marriage. What would all these variables have to do with the woman I'm going to marry? And yet, through a process of systematic dialogue and information that is both anecdotal and practical, they may come forward with certain prognosis of what the future would look like in undertaking this farming experiment, or in engaging, even when you're taking a journey, what day is suitable to leave your community. Related to that is a fundamental commitment to a set of values. Values which are not only transformative of society, but transformative in a very constructive way. Respect. Avoidance of cheating. Communal and community spirit, cooperation with others. And based on these sets of variables, both ancestral and current information, they're able to come forward to you with a set of options of when you might start your farming experiment, or when you might start your journey, or when you might engage in a marriage ceremony. On the basis of and there's a whole construct of variables that are driven by something that Tracy was talking about, of the facilitator of knowledge, the ones who help construct a theory of change, of circumstances, of social transformation that you want to engage in. And that facilitator is somebody who is not so much a specialist, but a listener and accumulator of information and projecting these. Based on quite a number of variables of indigenous knowledge systems that are used to construct community projects or individual projects, you're then able to begin to assemble the kind of focus group of both listeners and doers. In doing this, we're using part of that process to construct methodology of indigenous knowledge, which itself provides for monitoring and evaluation, not so much as a naming and shaming and blaming game, but as part of the matrix of information gathering that is used primarily for the purpose of improving societal well-being. And two very practical manifestations of these for me, and I'm sure others who have tried it can attest to other ways of doing it. One approach, one way of applying this is that we've used indigenous knowledge systems. Sometimes, people even talk about them as forms of divination. My great-grandfather was a soothsayer. I don't know how many people in this room know what a soothsayer is. But, in other parlance, they would say a witch doctor, or somebody who sort of throws trinkets around and then tells you how many children you're going to have, if they're going to be twins. But these are actually scientists who are part of the system of indigenous knowledge and are vectors of knowledge, are able to accumulate social, sometimes cosmic, sometimes ecological information to actually establish patterns of relationships. They're not always accurate, but at least they can give options. And if you take that approach, you can then begin to relate to community work in which people throw out vignettes of knowledge. And on the basis of these vignettes, are able to establish consensus or disagreements about how to value. So for example, we've used that technique to do the monitoring of projects, community assets, education, or health. And through throwing out different aspects of that project, women and children are able to rate the performance of these projects on the basis of different value systems. Sometimes may even score them and use the scores to generate discourses about performance. Now, what is critical about this is not so much the scoring, it is the generation of discourses about performance. And these discourses are intended primarily to strengthen performance rather than necessarily critique. They open up spaces for using monitoring data to learn, and they always give a range of learning variables. A second aspect, a second very practical application, recent work I've been involved in with urban poor networks. There's a group that calls itself the Slum Dwellers International, and they have chapters in over 60 countries. And most recently, we've been working in South Africa, in Uganda, in Kenya. These are people who live in very, very densely populated slum areas, often without shelter, but they sort of put together small shacks. And when you work among urban poor networks of this nature, their only recognition of monitoring is to look at their current existence, to establish markers for what future they intend to build, and to use those markers to construct social knowledge about where they're coming from and where they're going. And through that collaborative process of setting out markers about their vision, and about the reality of their life, they can actually begin to construct a different worldview of what they want to be, whether in agitating for increased access to land, in collective savings, in also building the kinds of relationships that would lead to their transformation. So I just thought I would throw out a few of these random thoughts, that when we think about monitoring as an external imposition based on the obligation to supply information that will assess performance of responsibilities of an assistance project, if we flip it around into our own social existence, and especially into the foundations of indigenous knowledge, we begin to recognize that these capabilities exist, and then we begin to internalize the notion of monitoring, and a notion of monitoring which is more oriented towards learning, building social capital and social transformation, rather than one which seeks to impose an obligation to supply information to track the performance of an obligation that somebody else accorded to us. So, I am open to questions. I hope I have been able to use the 2 minutes you gave me.
I'm sorry that the panel is running late. I will invite questions from the audience right away. Okay.
I'm curious, you mentioned customer satisfaction scores. I work in the private sector, and I think it's very, very important. What other or other tools to simulate things like customer satisfaction scores in the context or project?
Sure. So just to give a quick hypothetical, and this is a hypothetical, but we may run it sometime soon. Imagine a program that's working with smallholder farmers to introduce some improvement in their processing of their product, and you're working with scores of farmer groups and with different extension agents from your organization. You could run by month, every couple of months, you could do a very simple 3-question SMS survey to find out how those farmers are experiencing those business advisors and those ag extension agents on closed-end Likert type questions of the kind they use in customer satisfaction, like how much did you get from the last visit? Are you satisfied? Those kinds of questions. We can also ask some outcome questions. Well, what's changed for you as a result of this intervention? Those kinds of things. So you can get at both categories, the kind of more perceptual, how's the performance going, how's it working for you, and some outcome type questions that we're interested in.
Let me just add a dimension to it, that you can also, especially on the outcome type questions, preset some outcomes on the basis of stakeholder groups, to at least determine with stakeholder groups of various affected customers what typology of outcomes those stakeholder groups expect or envision. And that is sometimes a way of removing the specialist from it. And through those stakeholder groups, actually find the 3 or 4 outcomes that you can then carry out the survey, so that in fact the values that you're going to use in the survey are determined already by the stakeholder groups themselves.
That would be like me saying, if I buy a toothbrush, I want it to last a long time, and I want it to be defining those attributes
Absolutely.
up front.
Yeah, especially among very poor people, that the values that drive the social changes that they're looking at can only be best defined by them and not by somebody else who is anticipating their behavior. So you do a 2-stage thing. That forces you to some kind of qualitative engagement with the stakeholder groups.
Yep.
And then getting the basic indicators, and then a survey then accumulates.
I didn't prompt Suli to this, but that's how we develop our questionnaires. The people that are giving you the feedback, they need to be the ones to set what success looks like. And then they have a way to answer the question that's along their own frame, not yours.
To follow up on that, in theory, if you do the development and you're the one who's monitoring, in theory, you would have already been meeting with stakeholders before you move further to find out what their own are. In your actual experience, do you still recommend, surveying the stakeholders right before you monitor to find out what their expectations are kind of again, just to make sure, like we from a year ago, they changed their minds? So,
yeah, if I may, you don't in all cases hold everything static and expect that the same indicators you started with are going to be the same indicators that you end with. You have to, in my view, repeat the process, because society is dynamic and things change. The circumstances under which they may determine something to be successful may not be the same even 6 months later. And so that process of iteration is always important, that you keep re-engaging to see even the movement of the value systems, what they hold to be true a year ago may not be the same as a result of intervening variables. In that case, you can't do it simply as a linear process to say, these indicators I started with, I want to measure them over time. Now, it introduces complexities. You have to be able to allow for all the nuances. And that's why the process of dialogue